Oh, yes, none of those guys featured in that highlight video celebrating or sits by Michael F. Florio in Week 7. But it's time to discuss the quarterbacks in Week 8. Who are we getting into our lineups, Mike?
Well, you've covered this league a lot more than me, so weird things happen a lot in the NFL.
Occasionally, sometimes different stuff.
So after his worst career game, you have to start C.J. Stroud. Look, I know people might be like, oh, he struggled last week, but the matchup is why I'm all about starting him this week. He has the third most dropbacks this season under pressure, and he has struggled like any quarterback does while under pressure, but he has excelled when he has not been, and the Colts have generated pressure at the third lowest rate this season. They've also allowed the 7th most passing yards, and C.J. Stroud has multiple passing touchdowns every single game he has faced the Colts. So, yeah, I know last week wasn't his best, but give him another chance and continue riding with C.J. Stroud in your lineup.
So a guy who threw for 86 yards is a start this week, and a guy who's second in the league in passing yards is on your bench?
Yeah, Texas, I said one good thing about one of your quarterbacks. Please don't come for me this week, but I think you could sit Dak Prescott in this one because outside of that game against the Ravens, which if you remember, he was largely in catch-up mode the whole second half, Dak has not scored 17 in any other game besides that one. And in his 5 other games, he is averaging just 12 fantasy points per game, and the matchup is tough. You see there, the 49ers, 13 or more fantasy points just twice this year, and they have allowed 8 passing touchdowns in 7 games. They also have 8 interceptions in those 7 games. So if you could get away from Dak, I think you should this week. And then this one pains me to say it, but my guy Anthony Richardson, it just hasn't been happening as of late. His last 3 games, he has been held to single-digit fantasy points. In those 3 games, defenses are playing more zone coverage and specifically more single high or split safety coverage. The Texans use those coverages at an above league average rate, and they have used them more in their games against Anthony Richardson already. So that is concerning. And I know you might be like, Richardson has had success against the Texans in the past. It's all come on rushing touchdowns, and he has not been running near the goal line as of late. So I'm worried if you have the ability to get away from Anthony Richardson in this matchup, I think it's okay to do so.
All right. It's been a tough spot. Maybe it gets a little bit better. We'll go to running backs. Who's our start this week?
Man, I went on the pregame last week and said, sit Javonte Williams. He hasn't been getting it done, and I wore egg on my face all weekend. I'm not making that same mistake again. I think you start Javonte Williams, who has shown us that he can take advantage of good matchups. He's been getting more work, especially in the passing game. But when it comes to matchups, there's no better one than this. The Panthers have allowed the most fantasy points per game to running backs. They've allowed a top 6 fantasy running back in 5 of 7 weeks, and they've allowed by far the most touchdowns to the position as well. So I think you could plug in Javonte Williams with confidence. And speaking of confidence, there is one Kansas City player that you could trust with confidence, and it is a guy who was not on the roster at the start of the season. Kareem Hunt, 20-plus carries, 18-plus fantasy points in his last 2 games, and the matchup is fantastic. The Raiders have allowed a top 15 running back in 6 of their 7 games. They also allow explosive runs at an above league average rate. They are top 10 in yards and fantasy points per game allowed to the position. Yeah, Kareem Hunt, start him with confidence and get him in your lineups this week.
We started this by talking about weird stuff that happens. The Carson Steele era that 1 week, that was one of those weird things that I'm always going to think about. Let's go to the sits at the running back position.
It was awesome to have Nick Chubb back, and it's great to be able to watch him play play football, but I don't think you want to start him in fantasy, especially this week. Look, the touchdown was great, but he finished with just 32 yards last week, and most of his snaps and usage came in the first half. So I think we need to see him get back to being Nick Chubb, where he could play the full game, the full allotment of snaps. But it's the matchup more than anything. The Ravens have allowed the 2nd fewest rushing yards, fewest yards per carry, and fewest explosive runs to running backs this season. And before he got hurt, you see there, just 3 of 10 games against the Ravens with double-digit fantasy points. So as great of a story as it is to have him back, I think you enjoy it from a real-life perspective and not from a fantasy one.
Yeah, again, real life, the priority. Let's go get some sleepers with Marcus Grant.
Let's do that indeed. We're going to talk about some quarterbacks and running backs here as we get you some sleepers. We're going to start with a guy who maybe isn't quite a sleeper anymore, but I just want to shout out how well Caleb Williams has been playing. Remember at the first 2 weeks of the season, there's all this talk of, oh, Caleb Williams was a bust. And maybe the lesson there is to not judge a whole player's career on his first 2 games ever in the National Football League. Over the last 3 weeks, Williams has 7 touchdown passes, just 1 interception. He's gone for over 300 yards in 2 of his last 4. We've been picking on this Washington defense all year long. They've looked good against bad offenses like Cleveland, the Giants, and the Panthers, but they look bad against the good offenses like the Bucs, the Bengals, and the Ravens. I know that by the numbers, the Bears don't necessarily stack up as a good passing game, but I'm willing to believe that with the heater they're on, they can keep it going against Washington in what hopefully should be a matchup of the top 2 drafted quarterbacks in the league this past year. Next up, Ray Davis. Now, once James Cook came back, we saw Davis go back to limited snaps in the offense, but still, even with 5 carries, ran for 41 yards and a touchdown against the Tennessee Titans, averaging 5.5 yards per carry over the last 2 games. This week, he gets a Seattle defense that ranks 29th in run defense, giving up 5 yards per carry. And in what could be a high-scoring game, maybe we see some more snaps and more touches for Davis. And finally, a deep sleeper at the quarterback position. Yes, congratulations, Adam Rank. I have been Knicks-pilled. I am a believer, at least for this week I am, going against the Carolina defense that's allowed multiple touchdown passes in every game, including 2 touchdown passes by Marcus Mariota coming off the bench for an injured Jaden Daniels. The other part about Bo Nix that's been very sneakily productive, he is 4th among quarterbacks in rushing yards this year, 36 yards per game with 3 rushing touchdowns and 19 or more fantasy points in 3 of his last 5. So there it is. 2 quarterback leagues for sure, but maybe super deep leagues if you're feeling a little bit spicy. Talking about a little bit of Bo Nix there. Got a little bit emotional talking about Bo Nix. I know a lot of Bucs fans right now feeling emotional about their wide receiver situation. We're going to get emotional with Baker Mayfield, Mark Andrews, and a little bit more. Anthony Richardson perhaps on the menu? That's coming up after the break on Fantasy Live.
Back here on Fantasy Live, back in doing the starts and sits with Michael F. Florio. It's time to discuss some wide receivers, Mike. Let's start with the good. Which wideout is going in our lineup?
I think this is a week where you could go and get George Pickens in your starting lineup, if for no other reason. I think Russell Wilson is just a better fit for George Pickens. Like, you're seeing some of these deep throws here. These are not like dots or anything, but what they are, one of them even hit the Jets defender before Pickens made a play. The difference, though, is Fields is more of a velocity line drive type thrower, whereas Russell Wilson puts a ton of air under his deep ball, and it allows someone like George Pickens, who doesn't create the most separation, to just kind of become like a basketball player going up for a rebound or something like that. So I think it's a better fit. It utilizes his skill set a little bit more, and the upside is way too high to get away from. And then I'm starting Darnell Mooney as well. His career best fantasy game came a couple of weeks ago against this Bucs defense. But the Bucs play zone coverage at the 2nd highest rate in the NFL, and Mooney has really excelled against zone coverage this year. He knows how to find the soft spot there. Plus, the Bucs allow the 5th most fantasy points per game to wide receivers. There's just too much upside to get away from Mooney this week.
Yeah, maybe we get one of those calculator games that we got a few weeks ago with these teams. So let's go over to the sit side. Who are we getting on the bench?
No one has championed Deontay Johnson more this season than me, but I can't be biased. I've also told you to sit a bunch of really good wide receivers against the Denver defense. And look, not only has Denver allowed the 2nd fewest fantasy points per game to wide receivers, but when you look at how Deontay is used, primarily out wide, bouncing from left to right, that is exactly what Patrick Surtain does. And if you were the coach of the Denver Broncos facing the Panthers, you'd be like, yeah, Surtain, just stay wherever Deontay Johnson lines up. I expect the Denver Broncos to do that this week. And if that is the case, I think you want to get away from Deontay Johnson in fantasy.
Let's go over to the tight end position on the start side. Who shall it be?
There is one Brown that I feel confident about this week. It is David Njoku. You see there, 14 targets last week. 3 of them were end zone targets. We were saying there was going to be more volume without Amari Cooper. This is absolutely elite, must-start tight end volume, but it's also a good matchup. Ravens have allowed the most catches and yards to tight ends. 3 times they've allowed a top 3 fantasy tight end. So the volume and the matchup makes him a must-start. And I think you could start Sam Laporta. I will not lie. I was all ready to say sit him this week, but throw that all out the window because there's reason to believe he could see more volume this week. He could be the number 2 target for Jared Goff and the Lions like he was last season. And if that is the case, the upside is too high. You have to forget about what he's done so far this season and just realize he is the number 2 target potentially in one of the best offenses in football at the tight end position. That makes him a start.
Yeah, it's been up and down. People drafted him pretty high, but who's going on? Oh no, Pat Freiermuth's getting benched?
Yeah, I think you could go ahead and get away from Pat this week. Just 3 targets and 2 catches last week with Russell Wilson. He has only topped 40 yards twice this entire season. And the Giants defense, I don't think gets enough credit for as well as they have been playing. Their offense is abysmal, but their defense is really, really good. And in the last month, they've allowed the 3rd fewest fantasy points to tight ends. So not the week to get the Muth in your lineup.
All right, sit for Pat Freiermuth, but let's lay down. Who are we sleeping on, Marcus Grant?
Let's talk about some wide receivers and tight ends who might be sleepers for you. And earlier in the show, you heard Patrick talk about Jerry Jeudy and what he could do potentially this week for Cleveland. Let's talk about the wide receiver playing opposite of him, and that's going to be Cedric Tillman, who was a very popular ad off the waiver wire after what he did last week. Season-high 66 snaps, 12 targets, turned into 8 catches for 81 yards. Now, it turns out that it's going to be Jameis Winston at the quarterback spot. I had this whole narrative thing set up about Cedric Tillman and Dorian Thompson-Robinson being high school teammates, and I mean, that still is true, but it doesn't really matter for this game coming up this week. What does matter, though, Baltimore. 3rd best matchup for wide receivers this season. Most receiving touchdowns, 2nd most receiving yards allowed to wide receivers. Cleveland expected to be in a pass-heavy game script for this one. Over to the tight end spot. Evan Ingram, who you drafted him, you're probably getting a little bit impatient because he's only played 3 games this season and has been bad in 2 of them. But since coming back from a hamstring injury a couple of weeks ago, a team-high 27% target share. Plus, you go back through the history of Trevor Lawrence as a professional, no one has caught more passes from T-Law than Evan Ingram. Just targets galore between these two. Going against the Packer defense this week that has the 9th best matchup for tight ends. It's not going to be a lot of air yards for Evan Ingram, but could be a lot of targets in this PPR world we live in. That's going to work out pretty well. And a deep sleeper, going back to the wide receiver spot, and it's going to be Ricky Pearsall of the San Francisco 49ers, made his NFL debut last week. Just 5 targets, 3 catches for 21 yards, and pretty much everything was short. He's got it underneath some wide receiver screens, but now he's got a full week to sort of work in a different role. This is a guy who's a very good route runner, made some tough catches when he was in college. Could be asked to handle some of the things that Brandon Ayuk has left behind now that he is gone for the season. Throw in the fact that the Cowboys not going to have DeMarcus Lawrence, may or may not have Micah Parsons. That lack of a pass rush means that Brock Purdy should have time to stand in a clean pocket and get the ball out. So we could see Ricky Pearsall get a bit of opportunity coming up this week against the Cowboys. Speaking of coming up, we're going to do some trade opportunities. Are you possibly just going to sell low on Patrick Mahomes at this point? What about Kirk Cousins? Do you like that? I don't think Mustafa liked that a whole lot. We're going to trade opportunities coming up next on Fantasy Live.